All right, up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the California Underground. Today, I have Jason with me from the China Unraveled podcast. He is I would call him an expert, definitely much more than I'm an expert in terms of what's going on with China. And he reached out to me to talk about what is going on with China and California specifically. And I thought that was a really interesting topic because I don't really know too much about what China is doing. I know some things that we're going to talk about, but mostly I just want to hear his point of view and we can have this conversation. And as always, if you have any questions for Jason, just throw them up in the chat window and we'll get to them later in the show. But we'll start off, Jason. Go ahead, introduce yourself, tell us about your podcast and anything else you want to introduce to start off the show.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so my name's Jason Szeftel, and I have a podcast, China Unraveled Podcast. And the podcast is really pulled from a book that I've been writing for about two and a half years, and should hopefully come out by the end of the year. And it's pulling from, I don't know, about 15 years of interest and work and time spent in China. So I have a sort of a long history with that. And I'm from California and lived here. I went to school here for a while, and I'm back now. I'm actually in LA. And there's so much going on with what's happening in the Chinese economy and where California is going. And it relates to just a lot of our politics, a lot of the big issues about housing affordability and just all these issues. So it thought it'd be really cool to come on and just, see how much context and useful knowledge I can give people about what to expect and how to interpret some of what's been going on, specifically in a lot of the real estate over the last 10 years or so. So that's where it comes from.
Great. So I guess we could just start off and we'll start with broad and work backwards, if that's a good way to do it. On a scale of 1 to 10, how involved in California is China in terms of, let's just say, the economy?
Well, I'd say the broadest way to look at it is that basically since 2008 and 2009, we had the financial crisis, and China didn't get hit as hard as the United States and Europe. So this is going back 12, 13 years. But what it did is it really supercharged the amount of credit that it was producing in its economy. So it was pumping out something like an Obama stimulus package about every month for a long time, for many years. And when it got towards 2011, 2012, 2013, this was when China, as a state policy and as corporate policy, really started to tell companies, hey, China's on the world stage, China's moving out, it's going to start investing all over the world. And you just saw all the excess capital, all the excess credit, and all the supercharged companies that had all this liquidity. And individuals, they were just spewing their money all across the world. And California got a lot of it. So it just got so much of the money. So a lot of the money came through real estate investment. And California at the time, by 2013, 2014, 2015, something like 35% of all foreign residential real estate investment was coming into California. And we just saw this everywhere. The way it worked is that these Chinese companies were really the government was looking for state influence. So it was putting money into Africa. Everyone's heard about the Belt and Road. All these things were kind of sort of spinning up around this time. And a lot of the national champions were sort of supposed to spread their wings and, enter all these new markets. And it was going to be like a grand opening for, China on the world stage. America had just been sort of slapped by a big financial, recession. And China was going to emerge. And what we actually saw is that it was really similar to Japan in the late 1980s. So at that time, Japan was doing a similar thing. It was the top of a major credit super cycle. And Japan went and bought things like Columbia Pictures. Sony bought Columbia Pictures, and another company bought Rockefeller Center in New York. And well, that's kind of what we saw with China too. In 2015, this company called Anbang Insurance bought the Waldorf Astoria in New York for $2 billion, which is crazy price. And you started to see all this sort of stuff happen. And California, like the way it works is that there's only something like 4% of real estate transactions, of existing homes or existing properties in the US are foreign owned. But what happened is that Chinese investors and Chinese individuals and Chinese companies focused on all of these gateway cities into the United States. So they focused on Miami and New York and San Francisco and Seattle, and as well as Vancouver and, obviously in Canada, and then a lot in Los Angeles and Southern California as well. And this is what happened is that even though there's only 4% of the market is these, are these transactions, are these foreign purchases, it has a huge outsized effect in those markets. And so you just got all this money flooding in particular to West LA and Orange County and downtown, and obviously San Francisco and the peninsula there. And it was really part of this broader sort of upswing we saw in the real estate market during this time, especially in these sort of major coastal urban areas. And it's been a really major thing. So that's like at the broadest level. That's kind of where to start. Is this super cycle was happening within the United States, and then it was just supercharged by all this credit and money that was flowing in from China, and that's kind of the beginning of the story. And that's really what happened. So it was just a really, really exciting place for the Chinese people Chinese investors, companies, and individuals to put money. And a lot of them are actually trying to put money here to escape basically expropriation, the fear of expropriation, because they know we saw, I'll get to this in a little later, but they're fearful about what's happening in the Chinese economy, and they're trying to get as much money out as possible. So it's really just hot money, hot, scared money that's like flowing around the world and going to places with really good property laws, property systems where you can have a freehold. You can own a freehold property and it can't be taken by a foreign government, unlike, something in China. And so you just saw even more pressure to put it into these markets, and they knew it would be good. And then obviously people are more interested. If you're Chinese, you're more interested in buying something in Orange County than in St. Louis, because if you're a Chinese billionaire, you're probably more accepted. There's more of a community. It just sort of naturally made a lot of sense. And it's sort of on that Pacific Rim and embedded in a lot of different sort of networks. So Vancouver in particular has a really strong Chinese community, as does Southern California and San Francisco. And that's a really big part of sort of where we got to around 2015.
So you mentioned that a lot of Chinese investors are really just trying to get their money out of China. And I remember reading an article about how they had changed the law in China that they were dumping a lot of money into real estate. And then you probably know that China then said, okay, you can't do that anymore. There's a cap on how much you can do. And this affected construction here in California because there were projects that were being built in California in downtown areas that were then all of a sudden, well, there's no more money because they put a law on it in China. If I'm right, or you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So basically this whole splurge, like China, like go out into the world, go start, taking over, start investing, start winding up all sorts of businesses all around the world. That started to end in 2015. Basically what happened is in July, there was a stock bubble crashed. The Shanghai stock market crashed. And then the next month, in August of 2015, the Chinese yuan collapsed by 4% in 2 days. And this basically the Chinese government, the People's Bank of China, had to spend over $1 trillion of their reserves over the next around 2 years to fight a major currency problems. And this said a lot of things to the Communist Party. They said, okay, it's time for capital controls. That's the first thing. And so what you said is exactly right. They put a law, I believe it's $1 billion. You can't have any more of these, $1 billion plus investments I think it's companies, actually still companies, but definitely in real estate. You can't do it in these just hard assets that aren't gaining technology or know-how or things that you can bring back to the mainland, the motherland, to improve things over there. And things just started to wind down. And so what happened is that, maybe I think it was something like 35 billion a year or so in, Chinese money was coming to the California residential real estate market, or even I think it was 66. And it was huge. And that's now cut. And it just started to completely fall off the map. What we're seeing is we still see sort of like cash payments. Like you can get your money out of China. You can only take 50,000 out at a time in US equivalent of US dollars out at a time, but people are managing to get their money out of China. So there are many well-known stories of people who are being offered like in cash for some house in Manhattan Beach or something like that by a random person. And, you get it, you learn it's a buyer from China. So that's a major thing, but you're right. This ended. The Chinese government knew it needed to secure all the money that it could from its citizens to sort of sustain what it has and to sort of prevent serious capital flight. So what we've been seeing in China that year, 2015 and 2016, saw the most capital flight we've ever seen out of any country ever. Like it was bigger than after the end of the Soviet Union. It was bigger than Russia in 2013 and 2014. It was crazy. And so we've been seeing enormous capital flight out of China every year since, and it comes out in all these various ways. It's read as errors in their account, the various reports and accounts. But yeah, it's a big deal. And China's doing a lot of things to prevent that. We're seeing some crypto stuff now, but what it did is it just left husks, or like what you're talking about in downtown LA. There's a really big project. It was a 3-building project called think it's called Oceanwide Plaza, and it's in the South Park area of downtown, right next to the Staples Center in LA. And it's these are 3 buildings that are over 40 stories each, with a large sort of multi-story shopping mall complex at the base, just sort of connecting all of them. It's a full block, and it's a rare sort of building project for that market and for LA. But they went for it. There was a lot of interest from Asian investors in downtown LA and Koreatown, because these are areas that are very familiar to the investors in large cities like Hong Kong or Singapore. These large skyscrapers. They just figured, hey, downtown LA is such a dump. Eventually it's going to become great. So why don't we invest, build a huge tower? It's all going to become beautiful around it. And then, we'll be sitting pretty and we'll profit. So the biggest tower in LA now is actually built originally by, I think it was South Korean Airlines or something, has the Intercontinental Hotel in downtown. That was part of that boom. And it was huge. It really, for downtown LA in particular, it built so much investment. It would pretty much, I believe it was the biggest boom time in downtown LA construction since the 1920s. It's just been crazy. But not all of it has panned out. And so, like you said, there's all these projects that don't work out. And that one in particular, I think in 2019, this Oceanwide Plaza had to stop construction, and it hasn't found a buyer, and it hasn't found any sort of way to move forward. It has all these mechanics liens. It has all these major problems with the whole project. And it's hard to sell this sort of project because it's new to the LA market. Like, you can't just say, hey, you buy one tower, you have to do all of them. It's a major problem. In San Francisco, that same company is building a 2-tower complex, but they're sort of separate buildings, and it kind of also stopped construction, but it was able to sell one of them. And then, it'll finish in 2022 and it'll be able to sell the other. But in LA, this thing could end up a husk on the landscape for a while, because a lot of people are looking at, hey, if we're at the top of a real estate cycle, I don't want to be going in and buying this when we're no longer going to have all of these Asian or the sort of East Asian investors that are buying it as sort of foreign homes. So if you look at downtown LA at night, there's a lot of beautiful finished buildings that have no lights on. And well, that's because they're being used as assets. They're being used to store money. They're being used, something like 50% of foreign purchases of real estate in the US are just for, second homes or whatever, or just they were expecting it to appreciate, because that's what we saw when everyone started pulling into these residential urban real estate markets. The prices just went crazy. So suddenly it became a hot asset. So you had like Middle Eastern sheikhs and Russian oligarchs. Everybody was buying these. And so everyone's like, oh, now it's just a pure asset game. And it was fueling even more investment. So when China pulled back, it started to, spin back a lot of these processes.
Yeah. So these husks, and I keep focusing on downtown LA because in my experience, I've seen these buildings that were built and they're grandiose, and they just sit there, like you're saying. They'll sit there at night, no lights on or anything like that. San Diego, to a certain extent, most of the buildings I know that they built down here are full and they have people in them, but downtown LA makes me think that they were going for this boom. How does that affect the actual market around it? So you have them dumping a whole bunch of money into these projects and trying to revitalize, or at least just by happenstance, revitalizing the downtown area. Does that benefit downtown LA when they do that, or does it actually hurt because now you have this big empty black darkened building that's not doing anything?
Well, I think there's 2 things. I think there's a sort of a housing affordability question in general. So one thing, they've done some studies, and they found from 2012 to 2018, if you looked at the zip codes in the United States where there was a lot of sort of Chinese foreign purchases, they started out at around the same price level, and then 8 years later, they were 2 times pricier. They were 2 times more expensive in these neighborhoods, in these sort of hot neighborhoods. And they've also, in real estate in general, you get spillover effects. So the nearby neighborhoods also get some of those price increases. So it's rising. It does rise prices. But in something like downtown LA, I mean, let's be honest, downtown LA has serious problems and is in serious need of investment. So from my perspective, and this is just a small point, like from my perspective, if a lot of Korean, Singaporean, Indonesian, Japanese, Chinese investors want to come in and create a real metropolis in downtown LA and try and form something that looks more of like a core of a downtown of a major city, I mean, go for it. I don't think LA is really structured spatially to end up with that sort of arrangement of a metropolis. It's sort of maybe an old way of imagining how it will happen, but it has a lot of problems. So it's probably specifically for downtown, I'd say it's net a good thing. And these are assets that can always be, they'll buy it. So what's happening is that Oceanwide Holdings, which is the Chinese development company that in 2013 started going global and then bought this location and started building this Oceanwide Plaza in downtown and also the one in San Francisco, it's going to sell that property. It's going to end up selling that property to someone and they're going to buy it and it's going to lose a bunch of money because it's a mess. It's a mess project with all these loans and stuff, but it'll eventually be a useful asset likely for the region. I mean, it is something more like a Vegas property in a lot of ways, just the style, the way it's done. And unfortunately there's like the Fontainebleau and that thing has just been a mess for a long time. So you never know, but most likely it'll all be bought up and the real estate market can rejuvenate and sort of circle these assets around and cycle through them and get reinvestments. So overall, specifically for downtown, it's probably a net positive. And there's a lot of, it's specifically in that area, there's so much development going on. It's near the convention center, so they get a lot of hotel benefits. This is all very much a micro real estate thing that we're talking about, but it is real problems, and it's probably a good thing. But overall, the Chinese investment in a lot of these in these gateway cities has caused problems. And starting in 2011, a lot of countries started to create the equivalent of basically foreign buyer purchasing taxes. Basically, they say, hey, you're from a different country, you have to pay X amount more to purchase a home in our country, purchase a property. And it really spread like wildfire through a lot of countries. So that is something that the U.S. could think about doing. It depends on what we value, right? If we value people, citizens having access to properties and being able to purchase things, it's that, there's one set of policy responses. If you sort of believe in more unfettered global capital flows that will appreciate the values. I mean, there's certain people want different things. If you own property in California, well, let's have it rise as high as possible. That's what they think. If you want to have more properties available, if you want to have them more affordable, then that's sort of a different set of policies. But California has serious problems in its real estate and housing markets, that it's really not just Chinese capital, but Chinese capital really did bring a lot of this to light and then sort of add just the cherry on top of how crazy things can get.
So maybe it helps to back up a little bit, and because I'm not really familiar with this, and I think a lot of people who are listening is also probably have this question is,
sure,
if China says it's a communist country,
oh right, yeah,
how do they have billionaires that are investing so much money into America? And I think that always confuses a lot of people of, well, they're communists, but they have there's people who have billions of dollars. Maybe you could lay that out for the listeners so that they can kind of put that in their head of how this happened.
Sure. The best way to think about, so China is communist because it's ruled by the Communist Party. So, and there's a Communist Party. It has, I think, 90 million members. And the government there's basically a shadow government that is the party. It staffs all the different government agencies. It staffs also all the companies. And that's sort of the organizational structure. But realistically, this is just another instance of a general, like an imperial Chinese state. That's really the best way to think about it. It's cloaked in this ideology, but the nationalists and the original the Chinese communists in the last century, about 100 years ago, it's actually the Communist Party's birthday is July 1st, I believe, or it's coming up in a couple of days. So perfect time to talk about this. But it was just, a lot of this was just nationalist movements. And the way communism, there's a lot to talk about communism in China, but since 1978 and 1979, China has really just been trying to get wealthy and prevent itself from cracking into pieces. And it's done everything possible to prevent that from happening. And that means ditching all sorts of ideology or having hypocritical ideology. That's fine. It's more than willing to do it. And that's what it's done. And the real question in terms of ideology and communism, how can you have rich capitalists, is basically this ruling party wants to stay in power. And if you got rich in China, you have connections to the Communist Party. So the wealthy class, the political class, all of these are connected, and they've been scratching each other's back. So there's a large elite class in China that is trying to preserve all the gains that it had, and it was cloaked in communism because it was the Communist Party that ruled, and there would have been a bloody civil war. It almost did reach a bloody civil war in the late 1970s. So there's just been deep hypocrisy ever since, but it's been trying to get rich and not tumble into chaos. And that's kind of the core way to think about it. I mean, a really good phrase that people use is just state capitalism, where, yeah, it's basically like a statist or place with using capitalist mechanisms that are all very much state directed in a lot of industries. But the Chinese model is basically coming to an end in a lot of ways. It's the Chinese government knows this. Everybody knows this. It's going to be a real challenge. And I think that, yeah, there's definitely a lot to say about the Chinese Communist Party and all the hypocrisy and all the new slogans it comes and it trots out. But realistically, people should just think of it as a generic, giant statist, state nationalist sort of party that happens to be bright red.
So it's kind of like, let's just, like a hypothetical, like European country with a parliamentary system where that party just takes over and has power, but that doesn't mean the country necessarily becomes it. Does that make any sense? So like, let's say a party that's pro-statist capitalist takes over power in a country, but the underlying structure of is still capitalist. It's just the people in charge are a certain party. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd say
or am
that
I completely getting it wrong?
No, I mean, I think that a lot of the best way to think about it is probably just that the communist element is really primarily a varnish. It's primarily a varnish. And that's the best way to think about it. Like the Chinese state has always been it's trying to be an authoritarian, totalitarian, dictatorial state since forever. And that's the underlying state structure has been the same for like 2,200 years. So there's a deep history to it. The communism thing is actually extremely bizarre in a lot of ways, but what China ended up with, like the state system it ended up with, is very, very predictable. It probably would have ended up like this even if the nationalists had gained power. I mean, that's something I'm very big on. We think, oh, like, the US lost China, now it's a whole problem. Now we're stuck with this thing. It's like, if Chiang Kai-shek and they hadn't fled to Taiwan, they sort of ended up in China, probably also would have ended up with something like this, or the country would have split into pieces. It's just, you can't rule this country really without an iron hand. I mean, that's how it worked. Like the most easily governable, part of China, the core Chinese territory, is a region originally called the North China Plain. And it required an empire just to unite the different pieces of that. And then you had to have an empire to unite every other single larger piece that tried to put together. So every time China grew larger, it was actually growing more and more unmanageable. And the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty, it reached the large, crazy extent the largest basically extent that a Chinese state ever reached. And basically the second it got that big, it was like destined to disintegrate. And it did. So like when in 1911, the Chinese state just basically, it was called the Xinhai Revolution, but it was really a devolution where the whole state just split, like every region just spun off into its own orbit. And there's just warlords everywhere. Yeah. So that's kind of what happens in China. So basically, if you don't have like an iron fist, the iron hand at the top, you end up with warlords everywhere and giant war and violence and chaos. And so this is one of the things I try and tell, my audience and people who I'm talking to, is just China's one of those places. When the US went into Iraq in 2003, we said, we're bringing liberty and democracy. It's like, okay, Iraq's been a pretty mean place for 5,000 years. I don't know if the liberal democracy was on the way. I don't think we're the ones to bring it. And so some of what really got me into China was back at that time, I remember thinking, hey, like China's this giant country growing. It's insane. It's crazy. What would happen in a conflict? What would happen if we were, what is going to happen to a country like China? Like if we get into a conflict, what's our level of sophistication when we think about this country? Like our government was like, hey, Iraq, who cares about the massive ethnic, sectarian, religious, spiritual conflicts in this, in this region? Let's just, go in and we'll, replace the top of the guy at the top, replace it with something that works. And that doesn't happen. And I think China's one of those places that its whole history is just trying to make something work. Like the idea, like the US motto is like, out of many, one. China's motto is like, they'd love that motto. That's their goal, but it's really hard to do.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it with Iraq. It's not to get too far off tangent. I remember when I was in high school and we invaded Iraq, we had a speaker come to our school and talk. And I think it was a year or two after we invaded Iraq. And his whole position was we should have never toppled Saddam Hussein. And he's basically said what you said, which is this country and this region has been ruled like this for thousands of years. Us coming in and toppling it is not going to change anything. Like that's just the way this region is. So I guess to sum it up, China is definitely, you can't compare. They're like apples and oranges. They may be even like, it sounds like they may be even like apples and lug nuts. when you try and compare like China to like a Cuba in the sense of what is their model of government.
Yeah, China, I think it's a good point. Like with the Iraq example, they had the Ba'ath Party there, and you toppled the military, you sort of just disbanded the military, and the political figures and the whole political system sort of broke, and you had to replace it. It's tough for countries like Iraq or Iran or Russia. You need a strong state to keep things together, and there's always a tension. We obviously want better humanitarian, moral outcomes in a lot of these countries. We want them to have better food, water, electricity, human rights, all this stuff. But there's a real challenge. I mean, ultimately, a lot of this stems from the geography of these regions. For the same reason that a place like the Sahara Desert doesn't have major civilizations, the Arctic and Siberia don't have large population centers. There's certain structures that emerge in different regions that you need certain governance structures. And that's a huge thing. And China, one of its problems is it has so many different types of regions that are all so different that it's been for 2,200 years. It's been in a really, really, really it's been playing the imperialist game very hard for a very long time. It's been doing it really hard, and it hasn't fully succeeded. So it's just to give a sense of the scale of the problem. It's something that goes really deep. And for people, I think that's one thing that's sort of lost in our current debates. We sort of are always debating at the level of politics and policy and ideology, which is very important, but we do need to remember more of the ground layer of where how these things emerged, why they emerged, and if we want to change them, we really have to see. We have to be able to dig pretty deep to see why they got there in the first place. It's tough stuff. I hope that wasn't too abstract, but I don't want to get too far afield talking about sort of the nuts and bolts of a country like China or comparing it to Russia or something. But it's very important. It's something that's lost in our political talk these days.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of people just hear communist and they just automatically think of Cuba or Venezuela, and they just say, oh, they're all the same. But I think it's important to understand the context of where China is coming from.
Yeah.
And, circling back to why they are investing in places like California and downtown LA. So real estate is a big part, but they've kind of been limited with their laws. What are some other industries that the Chinese are investing in or that are putting their money in? One place, I mean, I have a hunch that maybe cannabis and cannabis farms and dispensaries, maybe one spot. That's just me. I work as an attorney. I've worked with cannabis investors, and they all are Chinese, and they have tons of money to burn, and they don't care that you tell them it's going to cost $3 million to start a dispensary, and they say no problem, whatever, we got the money. So that's one area that I believe. What are some other areas in California that they are investing in?
Well, that's actually a really good one. So agriculture in general, a lot of American agriculture is bizarrely highly from our perspective, it seems kind of bizarrely well regarded. But the Central Valley in California, a lot of agriculture there is the land, the output is pursued. I think also a very big China is one of its biggest roles in the California economy it relates to its overall sort of role with America, and that's really the port of LA and Long Beach. I mean, it's the largest port complex in the United States, and an enormous amount of East Asian trade comes through here. And so right now we have this massive backlog of like dozens of ships that are just waiting. There's a whole backlog. The whole coronavirus supply chain disruption has really messed up the whole process there. And we're actually starting to see it's gotten so bad that we're probably going to see a lot of reshoring and industrial movement just because there's not enough capacity at the ports for what's going on. And looks like it's going to last into 2023 even. So this is, 6 months, 3 months. Okay, we'll be okay. And we'll just change it up. But when you get to 2 or 3 years, you're thinking, okay, I think we need to make a change. And one of the things you see on the West Coast is that a lot of it really is this port, LA and Long Beach. It's huge. Oakland is much smaller. And then obviously the Seattle doesn't really hit the large market, doesn't move quite as easily across the country. So that's a really big one. And just like you said, there's agriculture, there's real estate, there's port logistics, and a lot of real estate also is the warehousing and all of that. That's actually still a very hot area, just in general with all the all the Amazon purchases, a lot of stuff that may be moving, a lot of investment that may be moved from commercial real estate is definitely moving into the more industrial warehousing logistics side of the market. And that's part of it. In the same way that a lot of old malls might be becoming housing apartments and condos and stuff like that. They're being converted. So you have those. Obviously tech as well, but now there's a huge, there's a lot more state and federal control, particularly federal controls of tech investment. So that's been also tamped down. But those are the major ones. And I think that is one of the really major areas. The logistics and the port activity is a huge part of the employment base, particularly in Southern California, which has a bit of a different structure than the Bay Area. And should there be a major conflict or problem with China or just shifts in trade, it would really negatively impact Los Angeles for sure.
Okay. I had a thought that was on the top of my head, and it just lost me. I had watched a video about how sort of COVID has really impacted the ports, and now we're having issues with, it's just supply chains have absolutely broken down. From ships couldn't get in, we weren't unloading them fast enough. Now we don't have enough truck drivers to bring the containers back, which now have to go back to China, which now need to come back here. So, and you're saying it probably won't be resolved for a couple more years.
Yeah, it's like it was looking like it would be going into the middle of 2022, but a lot of these backlogs, there's a lot of sort of permanent shifts. We're seeing a lot more purchases from home. We're seeing a lot of the consumer goods that were backlogged are getting pushed forward. And there's a finite, for example, there's maybe there's around 6,000 containers around the world. I mean, sorry, excuse me, container ships. And there's a set number of containers on them. And the way maritime logistics works, you have a ship and it has a bunch of stacked containers on it. And you sort of move along in this big circle, and you sort of take off the ones at the top are going to the port at the top. You sort of pull off all of the cargo as you go along, and you just keep going in circles or change your route or whatever. And we're seeing just problems at every level of this supply chain. So something like a lot of what China actually does, a lot of its manufacturing is really assembly. So it's assembling a product with pieces from all over. So, for example, I'm looking to get a new end cap for the top of my car, which is basically for the roof rack of my car. The end cap fell off, the thing you put like a surfboard to, and it's going to come, I think, in a month or two. I've been waiting maybe 3 months for a little piece of plastic, and people are seeing things like that for everything. And there were already a lot of forces that were pushing away from Chinese manufacturing and towards more of an American-centric system. So obviously there was tariffs, direct federal involvement, but there's also changes, for example, in the Chinese labor market. There's been a huge rise in prices in wages in China. There's also a rise in energy prices, and there's all these input costs that are going up. And it's been impacting a lot of industrial decisions for maybe the last 4 or 5 years, but it really accelerated in the last 2 years. People were originally looking at Vietnam and all these things we heard about. Oh, the tariffs, they're just going to move to Vietnam, which is true, or Malaysia, which is true. But now things are really shifting, and the sort of the global world we're entering, there's a lot less consumption generally. And so a large market like the United States is starting to gather more and more of the production. So for example, a company like Tesla, which is pretty hot, and obviously was the biggest stock story of last year. Tesla's production strategy is basically to buy or create its products where they're sold. So it has a factory in China. It's building a factory in Europe, and it's building a new factory in the US too. And that is really the sort of model that things are moving to in general. The system we had, it was built starting in the 80s of you have all these interchangeable cargo units. They can go all around the world, and you can basically arbitrage the lowest production cost, the lowest regulatory environment, the lowest tax burden everywhere all around the world for every single little part. And that's great until the supply chains crack. And then that one part that you need is what stops you. And if you don't have that one part, you can't build a bicycle. You can't do anything. You can't build anything. So it's changed everything. And we're seeing major strategic problems too. So at like a national level, the US has started doing industrial policy basically for the first time in a very long time. And I think for more conservative listeners, the worry is always what is the U.S. doing? Picking winners, picking losers, doing this, doing that. And that's very much true. But we saw this under Trump, and now we're seeing even more of it under Biden. And almost certainly we'd see even more of it under whoever a next conservative president or Republican president would be. It's sort of a general change in the way things are done. It's sort of a reaction to basically the way that China massively sort of monopolized a lot of the gains, the industrial and production gains of the last 30 or so years. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Wow. So we've talked about the economy and industries. Does China have any other influence in specific parts of California outside of the economy or industries that you're aware of, or anything just outside the realm of that?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, China's been very involved in California politics and politicians. It's it's had dealings in its hand with a lot of the Democratic politicians. I mean, obviously, almost all Democratic politicians throughout the state. That's pretty well known. The thing is, it's just become so toxic now that a lot of things are going underground and they're going through intermediaries. So that's kind of what's happening. So there's a bit more layers, a bit more removed from things, I guess you could say. It's hard to sort of get a read on, who's talking to China, who's doing X, who's doing Y. So if they are receiving money, it's a bit farther down the field. So that's one thing sort of on the political side of things. And then let me think of some other areas. I mean, the main one I really wanted to get, sort of talk about with people was the real estate one, because it's such a good example of the broader cycle that we're seeing. But what we're seeing in general with China, just sort of to get back to where we started, is that that phase from like 2008, 2015, 16, that came to an end, and China's been tightening up in general all around, or on all sorts of industries, on all sorts of capital, is imposing these capital controls. And that applies to businesses. So businesses can no longer buy like trophy assets all over the world. It doesn't really sell. So that originally that company Onbong Insurance that bought the Waldorf Astoria in New York, that company, well, it was first of all put under state conservatorship, so it basically became a state company, and then they were forced to sell it or whatever. So that's kind of a good story, like, so where that cycle ended. But yeah, China is really interested now in acquiring advanced technologies that are going to move it up the value chain. And it wants access to basically all of the high-tech Silicon Valley sort of companies in the US, but it's very hard for them to do that in this environment. I think there are a lot that are. There's a lot of people a lot of companies that are, for example, in a lot of the sort of self-driving car AI research. There's just a lot of international collaboration in general, but there's also collaboration with major Chinese companies like Baidu and Tencent and others. And these are there's sort of an international community of computer science researchers, practitioners that are involved in it. But again, it's a major area. It's a major problem area. And right now, China actually just passed basically a data security law, where China is now treating data like labor, land, and capital, and as something that the state is basically a state asset. So foreign companies cannot use Chinese data. They can't sort of take Chinese citizen data, Chinese data acquired in China out of the country for whatever their purposes are. So it sort of they want to sort of get an inbuilt advantage with their own large population. They can run large neural nets on and do a lot of, improve all their algorithms for, computer vision, or sort of, face detection, or, gait analysis, all these different things. That's kind of what they're going for. So it is definitely, the lines are definitely splitting. But I think we'll see. Yeah, I think the real estate, the agriculture, like you said, I mean, cannabis included, those are big. Those are probably the main ones, though. I think that what's happening in the U.S., just as a general thing, is that the millennial age group is sort of now hit 32. So that is pushing, 32 is typically the age when people move out of the expensive urban areas that they lived in, and they move to suburbs, and they start families, and they buy homes, et cetera, et cetera. So the entire millennial generation is sort of reaching that point, the middle of the generation. And so that's part of why we see this continued crazy rise in house prices all over the country, not just in the urban areas, right? Anymore, we see it everywhere as people fled because of COVID. And so that's happening at the same time. And that's sort of keeping a lot of these things going, even as, the Chinese aspect is pulling back. But what this, the proper aging of this millennial group also means is that the Gen Z, the next generation, is much smaller. So like you were talking about, the people at, they can't unload these things. There's not enough workers, not enough people. A lot of people they're getting money from the government, and they're not going back to a lot of these jobs. And there's also a lot of low skill jobs that simply won't come back at all. And this is really big for California because there's a huge, something like 80% of the jobs built since 2008, jobs created since 2008 pay less than, you know, the federal median wage. So there is something where it's heavily consolidated in, retail, hospitality, leisure, things like that, travel. And a lot of these jobs just may not come back because there isn't going to be as many Gen Z sort of people as there are millennials. So you just won't be able to fill these positions. So in the US, we had a larger population, a larger millennial population. So you could actually keep these roles. There's a lot of things in Italy, even, or in European countries that are simply automated away that are now going to be automated away, kind of like people have been talking about. We've been expecting a lot of automation to occur. And we kind of got ahead of ourselves, but it's definitely going to come now as we see a lot of these jobs that we're expecting to just fill back up from COVID. A lot of companies have already decided to move a lot of positions to being as automated as possible. So that's also a major thing that's occurring right now, and it definitely inflects with the China problem because a lot of this is being driven by data and by technology, and that's a major thing. I mean, another really cool area, not cool area, but it's an important area, is China's really on the vanguard of the regulation of a lot of these data monopolies, major internet platforms, major tech platforms, and the style of regulation that they use is going to be highly influential for countries around the world. It's also going to be a real sort of reference point for U.S. debates about what we should do. So it's important to keep that in mind because they're sort of dealing with many of the same things we are, except they have an authoritarian, totalitarian, murderous government that can sort of lay down the law, and we can't do that. But it's going to be theirs as well, and a sort of terrible option in a lot of ways.
So I have one more question that I think would be a good question to end on. But just as a side note, if anybody has any questions for Jason, post them in the chat and certainly ask them, because I feel like there's so much we could talk about. We could turn this into like a 4-hour podcast. So in your opinion, this may be a real loaded question. This may be tough to answer, but I'm considering you the expert and you know a lot about this. Is of China and what it does in California, is that a net positive or is it a net neutral? Or what's your view on China in California? Are there good things about what they're doing here? Are there bad things that we as Californians should kind of say, okay, that's too much, like we should push back on it? What's the state of China and California, and where are we going from here?
Well, I think the starting point was that California had a love affair with China, right? The state really did, and I think there's a bit of there's a necessary blowback to that love. And yeah, the question about is it net good or net bad? I'd say overall, to be honest, I'd say from 2008 to maybe 2015 when the money was really flowing in. I think that there were benefits for a lot of things. I think that what happened is that you sort of unbalance so many markets, and particularly the housing affordability, the real estate market, which has just caused so many problems. It's really been wrapped up in all of the problems of the homeless population, housing affordability. It really exacerbated a lot of these, and it just prevented the state government in particular from focusing on the ways that it could fix things. So I firmly believe that the major problems in California they don't come from China. And I think the state has the ability to fix all of the China problems in specific that are there. There's some tech things. You could do foreign purchase taxes if you want. But the real thing is if the state performed better, the state could make things so much better that even if China was doing more than it was doing now, it wouldn't impact the bottom line too bad. Do you know what I mean? Like we're functioning so poorly as sort of there's really no state direction in a positive direction. It's just hoping that Silicon Valley saves the world, saves everything, saves the budget, etc. And then sort of a lot of ideology and platitude. You really need a much broader sort of vision, but it's very, very difficult to find. It's not just a California problem. It's a problem for all of these states. I mean, any politician who gets any sort of notoriety, visibility. They just immediately want to become president or something. So they don't actually invest too much actually fixing anything. And things have just become so cultural and ideological that it's very hard to see the state moving forward with things. But I think that, I mean, the thing people should realize is that a lot of the way things will probably move is just through events, like the way we saw with the COVID and the pandemic. Like things changed rapidly. Telecommuting became a thing. Telemedicine became a thing. Instacart became a thing for groceries. That's going to be the way things move forward. We don't have enough, to be honest, state capacity to really move things. And China was taking advantage of that for a long time. So another way to look at it is that the China's success in California was very much a function of how incompetent a lot of the state was in sort of directing the state to its own sort of better place, better end. And the second there was a spotlight shined on that and said, hey, like, look at all these connections between California or Pelosi or whatever and China, then the state sort of got skittish and whatever, but it just didn't have the actual internal direction and vision and capacity to do anything. And that's still the main problem. But overall, I think that at this point, the unless it's clearly dubious state directed tech investment or something where it's like, hey, China's coming to blatantly and clearly and obviously steal some technology or something like that. You know, people want to invest in cannabis or certain assets. I mean, that isn't the biggest deal in the world, but I think it will get wrapped up in this broader China-US conflict, you know, both real and sort of more narrative conflict. So people should just expect everything to be taken really far out of proportion. Like we'll probably see more stories now about how China's super big in XYZ when that was the story maybe 6, 8 years ago. So there's always these lag times and there's often no context for where things began, where they moved to, where things started, where they're maybe going. So people could just get wrapped up in the moment. But I think we talked really about where things came from, and it should give people a good sense for what's happening. I mean, just in general, there's a major split. There's a major, decoupling split, whatever you want to call it, happening with the US and China. And China's really concerned with major internal stability and regional issues there. So it really doesn't have the fight. It's just, it wants the technologies to transform its society. If it can find them in California, it's going to try and get them. But in a lot of ways, this is no different from the French or the Israelis or all sorts of people who do all sorts of industrial espionage and stuff all around the world. So that's not super new. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think that we might also see there might be a lot less cooperation and more just overt cyber attacks, like we're starting to see this year as well. When you can't get things through cooperation, maybe you go and, try through more rough sorts of means. And that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But yeah, overall, it had a few good years. Probably benefited, some people. It exposed people to new ideas, new ways of being, new all that. That's good. But it's been a net negative for a while now, and it just detracts from this state and this country's more widely ability to just kind of define its own vision and start moving forward on it.
I never thought of that. That's an excellent point. That just like light bulb in my head is that it's not really. Everyone kind of always thinks it's like China being this like imperialistic country of like we have to take over the U.S. and like we're going to do it by it. And when you look at it at a sense of like, well, California's state, and because its state politics have been so lackluster without a direction for so long, China saw an opportunity. And that's really the fault of us as Californians not focusing on our local politicians. And you made a great point that as soon as somebody gets any sort of notoriety, everyone goes, oh, well, are they going to run for president in 2024? Are they going to run for president, 2030? It's almost immediately, it's the next question. And I always try and tell my listeners and followers, you want things to get better in California. Stop worrying about like who's president, like, and start worrying about who's your state assemblyman or your state senator, because that goes a long way. So that's a completely different angle, and just light bulb in my head. So I feel like I just saw a brand new perspective.
Oh, I'm glad that was a good light bulb. It's just always an interesting thing to remember about China is that China has always been an empire, not to like take over the rest of the world. It's just to rule itself, right? We think of empires as like the British Empire became an empire to like take over a quarter of the world, right? Or the Soviet Union functionally an empire to take over Europe, etc. China really, from the beginning, the empire is to keep itself together. It's it's the structure it needs to rule itself. And so when it's when it's investing and dipping its toes into Africa and all these things, it's really doing it often because of weakness or some leverage, immediate leverage it has. And yeah, that's really how it works kind of all around the world. It can try all sorts of things, but it's that would be a whole other topic about sort of China moving out more broadly into the world. But the way that it happened in California is pretty characteristic. California is obviously very developed, so you don't just like roll into a poor African country and like take over a little corner of it basically and do all this neo-colonial stuff. But the principle is pretty similar. And if you don't have the direction, it's kind of like anybody in our own personal lives. Like if we don't know where we're going or what to do, and people can sort of sense that and sort of get you to do a little bit of this and help me out with that, and I need a little bit of this. It's not terrible, but maybe we could kind of find out what we're about. That's all.
Yeah, we could do a little bit better job of protecting like our stuff here and not just letting everybody else come and take our stuff. So I think we're about 50 minutes in. Is there anything you'd like to add where people can find more about you? I know you said you had a book coming out. So, plug away on what's coming up for you.
Sure. I guess the best way to probably reach me is I started using Twitter. You can find me there. It's at Jason Szeftel. So last name is Jason, then last name Szeftel. That's kind of where the best place to find me or contact me. You can check out the website. There's some essays there. There's some articles. There's of course the podcast, which is sort of being reimagined right now to sort of make it more accessible and sort of get it more often. There's also a YouTube page where I'm sort of doing some live, some occasional live streams, and people are starting to ask me questions. I might start doing some more Q&A sort of stuff there. And then, I think there's a book that I've been working on for a while that'll come out. It's not really here totally to plug it, but it'll also probably be called China Unraveled, and it'll hopefully it's the purpose of it is to give people a sense of China and the different regions of China, kind of like we have in the US, right? So in the US, there's Appalachia, and there's the West Coast, and there's the mountain region, and there's the South, and there's Texas, and there's New England. And when you could start getting a sense of China like that, I mean, first of all, it's really helpful because there's regions in China that are more populous than any country in Europe. So it's just probably a smart way to go. But it also gives you a sense of really what's going on. It'll give people a sense of where things are probably going if things don't, as they're probably want to do, just start to break down a bit in China. It'll give you a sense of what's actually happening there. And that's the most of it. And there's also, I'm doing a bit of a newsletter, but I'll just leave it at that. Just check me out on Twitter is the place to find me.
Awesome. Well, I feel like I learned a lot, and I think a lot of my listeners will learn a lot. And like I said, I think we could talk about more of this stuff for like another 2 or 3 hours. So would you like to ever come back is my question.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be really fun. I think it would be really cool. There's kind of the way I work is I spent a lot of years building like a bit of a comprehensive look at China. And I basically go and I talk about different sectors. So I have an article coming out about China's energy sector. I've written about its agriculture system, military stuff, real estate, all of these different things. And I really enjoyed coming in here just talking about California because it's my home, and I know a lot about things in this state and how it relates. So that was very fun. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about, and if we could talk about really whatever you're interested in. I really enjoyed it, so I'd love to come back on.
Great. Cool. So we'll have you back on then. Thanks a lot for coming on. For everybody else who was tuning in, thank you for tuning in as always. New schedule every Thursday at 8 a.m. streaming live on YouTube, and then you can find the audio podcast anywhere on Spotify, Google, Apple, all those places. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, review, all that jargon. And thanks again. I'll see you on the next one.